So what we're going to look at in this video is going to be a bar chart. A bar chart is basically a series of bars. The type of bar chart we're going to be looking at in this video is a horizontal bar chart. So it typically runs from left to right. So why should you care about this type of chart? Well, in practice, this chart is really important because it is very versatile. So you can use it for multiple different kinds of applications, and most likely what's going to happen is you're going to find yourself using this chart many times in any given set of analysis you're going to be running. And the reason for that is that a lot of the time you're going to be looking at temporal information, so information that has to do with time. And so it just so happens that this type of chart is really good for representing this kind of information visually. And so therefore, given the number of things you're going to be looking at across time, more often than not, you're just going to find yourself using this type of chart and this type of layout over and over again. So it's really good. It's a real workhorse when it comes to chart making. So what is the basic principle behind constructing this chart? And what you're looking for is anything that is showing some sort of value or some sort of metric which is changing over time. And that time period can be anything, can be years, decades, can also be quarters, months, or days, or hours, literally anything. And the metric of choice can likewise be anything. So it can be things like revenue, it can also be things like EBITDA, operating profit, market cap, headcount, size of the market, production volumes, etc. So very versatile, like I said, and so it can lend itself to representing a variety of metrics across a variety of time periods. So an example that is shown on this page is a bar chart representing revenue and how it evolved for division A of a notional company between the periods of 2019 to 2023. So imagine that we looking at results just after the end of 2023, and so in that sense this chart is showing us last 5 years of revenue evolution. What you can see is that in 2019, revenue was sitting at 120 million US dollars, then it decreased to 80, then after that it decreased to 70 in 2021, and then after that it started growing again. So firstly to 90 in 2022, and then to 100 in 2023. We also left a bit of space for some observations, and so you can see that, example observations you can derive from a chart like this could be something like what's written here. So firstly, that Division A has been able to reverse the decline in its revenue, which took place between 2019 and 2021, and then that in 2023, that revenue increased by about 10%, so that's the latest period for which data was available. And then if you compare that latest period of 2023 to the lowest value over the last 5 years, then that increase was roughly 43%, but still lower than the peak value which was recorded in 2019 by about $20 million. So that's the example chart. So there's a few tips and tricks for when you use a horizontal bar chart like this. So the first one is that you should try to avoid having too many periods represented. So you see in the example that we have here that we chose to represent the last 5 years. Presumably, we could have also represented the last 30 years, but that would have probably been a bit too much information. There's no hard and fast rule for exactly how many periods is okay and when it starts being too much, but just use common sense and just ask yourself if you're presenting too much information compared to what you really need. So maybe something like 5, 6, maybe even 7 periods is okay, and then after that it sort of becomes a bit excessive. But what do you do if you have more information than what is optimal for representing on a chart like this? What you can do is you can group things. So for example, let's say that we also had data for 6 years, or let's say we had data for 5 years preceding 2019. And so what we could have done is we could have said, instead of where it says 2019, we could have grouped those periods and maybe shown minimum and maximum, and called that part of the chart a period of 2015 to 2019. And so that would have then saved us real estate on the chart while still presenting that information. And that information is interesting, but it's probably not as critical because it was such a long time ago. But so this way we're able to satisfy both objectives presenting that information on an off chance it is useful to someone, but then also not taking up too much space on a page to present that information. The second tip is that there could be times where you have some of the information, but not all of the information that you need. So for example, let's assume that you were missing data for 2022, but you had data available for all the other periods. So a little trick you can use in that case is that you can just gray out the column or the bar that would have been sitting in place of where it says 2022. And then you can also add a bit of text on top of that and just explain why that information is not available, or that you're waiting for that information, and you'll insert the value once it becomes available, or something else to that effect. And so that way you're still able to make use of the other information that you've already got and have some analysis and conclusions and discussion be driven by this information, even if that information is imperfect. And so often in the real world, that's what you will end up having to do, because not always do you have all of the information that you would like to represent on a chart like this. The third tip is that you can also use white space above the chart productively as well. So in this example, you can already see that we've inserted an arrow that shows the delta between 2021 and 2023, which is showing that the increase was equal to 43%. So you can see that already just by doing that, the chart looks much more interesting compared to what it would have looked like without it. And that information is actually genuinely useful, because it kind of shows you the delta between, the lowest amount of revenue over the last 5 years and where we are currently. If you don't want to use an arrow like this, you can also just maybe have a call out or some sort of text box over a specific period and provide additional supplementary information about that bar chart if you wanted to. So what it does is that it just makes your chart look a bit more professional and finished, and just adds a bit more visual interest as well. Now be careful here too, because what you don't want to do is overload it and just use up all of the white space that is available. You're going to need to let your chart breathe and have some of that white space. So you have to use your judgment in terms of how much information is too much. But if you added a little bit of visual interest / useful information that you've identified in analyzing the data for the chart, then that helps improve the visual characteristics of the page. The fourth tip is that what you'd often find yourself doing is using this type of chart over and over again, like we said in the beginning, throughout your presentation. Now, what's going to happen in that case is that for a reader or for your audience, it might become a little bit confusing if all the charts sort of look the same, but are meant to represent different types of information. And so one little trick you can use there is that different type of metrics can have different colors. So for example, you could use dark navy for revenue, you could use gray for costs, you could use maybe some sort of hashed pattern for EBITDA, and so on. And that way, even though you're using the same type of chart throughout the presentation, visually they all look different. And so it just helps your audience understand that you're talking about different things across all of those pages with the same type of chart. So that's a neat little trick you can use to avoid proliferating too many types of charts and just using one that works best, like the horizontal bar chart, but also making it relatively easy for your audience to follow along and understand the differences between different types of information you're talking about. Now, there's a couple don'ts as well that are important to keep in mind. So the first one is that you really only want to use this chart for time-related information. So an alternative way how this chart could be used is that you could use it for category-based information. So instead of where it says 2019, 2020, 21, etc., we could have had, let's say, Division A, Division B, Division C, or Market A, Market B, Market C, etc. So that's category-based information. There's a different type of chart that should be used for category-based information, and it looks very similar to this. So it is still a bar chart, but instead of running horizontally from left to right, it usually runs vertically from top to bottom. And so that second type of chart, the vertical bar chart, is well suited to presenting information based on categories, whereas this type of chart, which is the horizontal bar chart, which runs from left to right, is best suited for presenting time-based information. And so it is a good idea to keep those two things separate and just be a little bit disciplined about what types of charts you choose to present what types of information. So it just makes it easier to follow. It's a bit more intuitive that way. And then your audience will appreciate that you've taken the thought in terms of which chart suits which purpose better, because that ultimately makes it easier for the audience to understand what's going on. The second don't is that, like we said, you don't want to use too much information on a chart like this. Because this chart is so versatile, that does happen. And there's a big risk that you might be tempted to include lots and lots of information, basically everything you found, onto a chart like this. And so the advice here is that you refrain from doing this. So one example of how you could be inserting too much information into a chart like this is that each bar could have subcomponents. So for example, revenue, let's say for 2019, could have subcomponents where that 120 million could have been broken down by customer or by type of product or by country where sales originated from, etc., etc. And same could be true for all the other bars in the chart as well. Now, that does add information, and there could be a use case for presenting that additional information, but more often than not, it just ends up creating clutter, and that is almost never a good idea. So if there is additional information that you are convinced is helpful, by all means, present that. But if really the information you're presenting is only there because you have it, but you can't really explain the exact purpose of presenting that information or the exact conclusion it helps to draw, then it probably means that that information is not essential. And so more often than not, it's best to avoid presenting non-essential information and just keep it in the backup somewhere. Keep it in your Excel file, or take a screenshot of the Excel and chuck it onto a separate page and put it in the appendix of the document if you want to, just in case you need to refer to it at some stage. But for the main chart, it is a good idea not to overload it, and so avoid that. Remember that, beauty and power really is in simplicity. So if you can keep things relatively simple, that's gonna serve you well when it comes to visual presentation. So in conclusion, like I said, this chart is a real workhorse that you're gonna be using over and over and over again for presenting various kinds of information and telling all kinds of stories and explaining all kinds of business phenomena. And so it is good that you learn how to use it really well, experiment, try to see when this type of chart looks good, when it doesn't look good, understand what's the difference between those two outcomes, and just get real proficient using it and making it look elegant and professional. And because this slide is gonna be used so many times throughout your pack, then that will translate into most of the pack looking elegant and professional as well. So it's a real good investment of time getting real familiar with this type of chart.